Hi, my name is Ahmad. I'm a licensed insolvency practitioner and chartered accountant. I've been working in the business recovery and insolvency industry for over 20 years, and I co-founded Bailey Ahmad Business Recovery in 2007. In this video, I'm going to give you an insight from my perspective of what it's like to be an insolvency practitioner. What do we do and where do we fit in? I'm going to touch on the human aspect of what we do and how we deal with stakeholders. I'm going to discuss some real life stories from my own personal experiences, touch on some strategies specifically in a corporate setting that we might implement, some of the innovations in our industry, and I'll round off with some of my final thoughts on the future. So what is it like being an insolvency practitioner? This is probably for those that might be thinking about a career in insolvency, and certainly we do see a number of people in our profession move towards it after qualifying as an accountant. But it's something that I found out about by chance. A career in insolvency is something I didn't know a lot about prior to falling into it. It's beyond the rigour and beyond the effort that needs to be spent trying to get qualified as a practitioner, and it's pretty tough stuff. And beyond the technical, there is a really interesting side to this industry in that you are exposed to the extremes of business failure, human failure in a financial sense. You get to understand real stakeholder motivations and interactions between them. It's commercially weighted, but it's emotionally weighted too. So even beyond qualifying, I'm learning each day by experiencing people's decision-making process, experience how they deal with difficulties, failure, how able people are to adjust to difficult decisions and recover from them. And through that process, I've also met some fantastic advisors. We don't work in a bubble. We work alongside solicitors, accountants, bankers, financiers, investors and business owners, and all those that are affected by a difficult situation. And you get to understand really what they can do and what they're prepared to do. And a lot of it comes down to communication and trust. Communication and trust and transparency. If you have those things in place, a lot can be done. It's amazing what we as people can achieve if we work together. And we get thrown in as insolvency practitioners into very different and varied situations. And I find that challenging, emotionally tiring at times, but also incredibly interesting, and something that improves me through each case, each journey. So I'm constantly learning. So if you're interested in a career that has those aspects, certainly business recovery, insolvency, which is a wide spectrum, has that. So where do insolvency practitioners fit in? The first thing I want to note is that the insolvency profession is a very broad church. There are practitioners and firms that will have specialisms or deal with different scales of organisations. We can deal with individuals and corporate entities. For the purpose of this video, I'm going to focus on corporate SMEs. And in that context, where do we get involved? Well, we tend to get involved at the extremes of business success and failure. And what do I mean by that? Well, in the context of success, it may well be a scenario such as a business that's come to the end of its life. There are surplus assets that need to be distributed to the company's shareholders, but they want an independent party to come in and ensure that the company's affairs are wound up properly, dealt with properly. And we as licensed insolvency practitioners can act as liquidators of those companies, and it's our job to ensure an orderly winding up, ensuring that everybody gets paid and that any surplus is distributed to the owners of the company in a fair and appropriate way. More commonly, we're associated with advising businesses that are in financial difficulty. They're at the point where they anticipate or are unable to pay their debts when they fall due. They may well be under pressure from creditors to pay, and there's a real threat that the company may well not survive without intervention. It's in this space that insolvency practitioners will be able to deploy a number of strategies to facilitate a recovery, a turnaround, a restructure, or if appropriate, an orderly cessation of a company's trade to minimise the loss to creditors. There are a number of tools that we have available to us that we are trained in, and licensed to implement tools that you may have heard of in the media, such as administration of a company, a liquidation of a company voluntary arrangement. I won't go into a lot of detail on those tools. There's a lot of information on the ICAEW website, and they've produced a fantastic guide on this. And ultimately, if faced with that situation, you do need to seek specialist advice, and you should recommend to clients, or if indeed you're involved in a business that needs that sort of help, engage with a practitioner sooner rather than later. But ultimately, we have experience and skill in that area, and we can engage in communication between various stakeholders, and we can decide on what's the most appropriate strategy. And the earlier that we're engaged, often the more options that are available. There's time to engage, communicate, and explore possible informal strategies before more involved and probably costly insolvency processes have to be called upon. Something that I'd like to touch on is the human aspect of what we do as insolvency practitioners. All insolvency practitioners should be qualified, regulated, technically proficient people. We understand the rules, we understand best practice. We are good at following those procedures. We should also be really skilled in the commercial aspects of business in general and understand stakeholders and where they sit within a business. But the thing that isn't in the textbooks is that we're ultimately dealing with people. And we're often dealing with, in a business recovery setting, people that are not getting what they hoped for or expected. You will often find owners reluctant to seek help. Businesses form part of who they are, and this may well feel to them an admission of failure. They should know the answers. The truth is, they will often be dealing with risk when operating a business, and events may well happen that they couldn't have anticipated. The biggest failure is often not seeking help when you need it, and I think that's a lesson for many aspects of life. And one of the things a skilled insolvency practitioner will do is will have a good understanding of various stakeholder interests, where they're coming from. We'll have empathy, and that comes from understanding and imagining yourself how you would feel in that position. But we also represent a bridge between stakeholders with competing interests. So look to the people, understand who they are, and even if you know that the message you have to deliver is a challenging one for them to take on board, they will see empathy in you and they will understand that. So one of my successes and something I continue to work towards is being just a good human being when dealing with challenging situations. There probably should be a chapter on that, or even a whole paper in the insolvency exams, and maybe that'll happen one day. But in my experience, this defines what a good insolvency practitioner is, or a good professional, a good business owner, or a good stakeholder. So let me talk about a real life scenario to give you some context. This is a scenario where we were able to achieve a rescue of a company as a going concern and its business intact. It was a technology business that specialized in implementing the Salesforce CRM package. It had been incredibly successful. It had built up a number of blue chip clients. It had grown dramatically. It was supported by quality individuals that had experience in the tech world. But the issue with it was that it wasn't generating a huge amount of profitability. And it was relying on rounds of funding to achieve a level of growth that they felt they needed to aspire to result in an eventual exit of the business. Unfortunately, due to a change in economic circumstances, a round of funding they relied on didn't arrive. And then they were faced with the very real issue that they didn't have sufficient funds available to meet some substantial debts that had accumulated. In this case, primarily with HMRC. The debts were, I think, in the region of £1.5 to £2 million at the time, and HMRC were understandably keen to get repaid. The company had entered into a repayment strategy with HMRC, but realised that it overcommitted. When I sat down with the company directors, who were obviously distressed about the prospect of failure, it was clear that there was a really sound business that was underlying the issues that had arisen. But they needed to reduce some of their costs, restructure their pricing, and introduce some additional funding to meet some immediate working capital needs. Well, that funding was available, but it was limited, and certainly wouldn't be enough for the company to meet its substantial obligation that was due now to its trade creditors and HMRC. But given the projections of the business going forward were positive, following some change, it would generate sufficient profits to repay HMRC potentially the whole debt over a period of up to 5 years. We structured a company voluntary arrangement, a proposal put to HMRC and the other unsecured creditors to repay the debts that had accumulated to them, but over a longer period of up to 5 years. When compared to the alternative of forcing the company to cease to trade, which was a very real threat at the time, the return would have been negligible. The assets were worth very little, largely the ongoing contracts that existed, but if the company couldn't trade or fulfill its obligations, those contracts would be worthless. The physical assets were also of negligible value, but the value was in the long-standing customer relations that existed and the profitability that could be generated with a restructured model. They accepted the proposal along with other creditors, and the company proceeded to continue to trade, continue to meet its ongoing obligations, and as the profits were generated, it was paid into the company voluntary arrangement, and that was then used to discharge the debt with the historic unsecured creditors. It was a great example of how a business that had overreached itself, had faced a challenge that it didn't expect, was able, with the help of an insolvency solution, to not only survive, get through that situation, and then go on to be successful. And my role as an insolvency practitioner was first to identify that there was a viable underlying business there with the company's directors and the finance director, was to recognise that there was a real prospect of a company voluntary arrangement being the right solution, to help them formulate those proposals, to take an independent view on viability because I wasn't bound or close to the business, to communicate that to the company's creditors, take on board their concerns, understand what their concerns would be in advance and ensure that the proposals accounted for that. And then when it was agreed, my job was to monitor and ensure that the CVA was completed as envisaged. The result was a business that left, to some extent, my involvement intact with the same management team, with largely the same employment structure, with a future ahead of it. Unfortunately, we're not able to always save companies and businesses as a going concern. And at the more extreme end of what we have to deal with, we have to help directors recognise when the situation is so severe that actually the right thing to do may well be to draw a line under continued trade, but facilitate some structured end to the business in a safe or as safe as possible way to minimise the loss to all those affected, but also allow them and others to move forward, to restart, regroup and contribute again. Now, that can be incredibly difficult, as you would imagine. That will involve potentially staff redundancies. It may well involve telling creditors they're not going to receive everything they hope to receive. And it will involve a director, to some extent, dealing with failure. But in my experience, it's tough, but actually people get through all of that. They will go back to work, they'll find other opportunities, they will start businesses again, and they'll continue to trade. Key is that everyone does it in an open, upfront way, and the insolvency practitioner facilitates that process. It facilitates a transparency between all the stakeholders. The insolvency regime is there to hold bad directors to account. Thankfully, that is rare, but they do exist. But it's also there to give good directors the opportunity to explain and communicate what they've done, why the company or business is where it is today, and also allow them an opportunity to restart and regroup and move forward. And certainly, as a result of the coronavirus, we're going to see many businesses that were built on a model that would work in a pre-COVID-19 world. But the world that we seem to be emerging in has such material differences in some ways that those old models don't always easily adapt. We can do our best, but there will be businesses that just won't work. And we need to be there And we are there to help people move to a world in which they can start and rebuild again. And that's all stakeholders and all those involved. Innovation is something that we're all experiencing across all walks of life, all jobs, professions. Certainly this move to home working very quickly has forced many businesses to adopt procedures and policies ahead of time. Certainly we've taken the decision as a business to adopt a flexible working policy and really embrace that. That comes with a number of challenges, and we have to rethink how we operate. But we are all becoming more capable. We're all becoming better communicators. We're all able to do more and do it better. But sometimes innovation within the frameworks that underpin us take time, and certainly the insolvency profession is underpinned by law largely. But we are seeing some innovation at this time with the introduction of the Corporate Insolvency and Governance Bill. Now I'll just summarise a few of the things within it. We're seeing an introduction of a moratorium procedure that will allow viable businesses some time to restructure themselves without the threat of creditors winding them up, putting them into an insolvency process. We're also seeing restrictions on some termination clauses which would have made a restructuring plan impossible sometimes. We're seeing a suspension of winding up petitions for a period of time, so businesses who are in a very difficult position, potentially unable to trade at the moment, not fearful that they're going to be wound up by a creditor that's being overly aggressive. And there's a new restructuring provision there too for larger organisations in more complex plans of reorganisation and restructuring. So these are good things that are happening, and I'm hopeful that these will continue. Now some of these things may well have unintended consequences, there may be some adjustments that need to be made, but that's part of progress and that's part of innovation. Business owners shouldn't be afraid of failing when they aspire to do better things, and neither should our profession. And we should embrace these changes as much as we can. So as an insolvency practitioner, what are my thoughts about the future? I've been asked a lot about this. We're all going to be adjusting, all stakeholders. I've already seen some very capable entrepreneurs and capable advisors showing what they're made of, showing their ability and their strength, thinking creatively in very, very tough circumstances. We've also seen government intervention that's unprecedented. I'm hopeful for the future. I do know that there will be a period of adjustment, and I do know that my optimism is more around people's resilience and ability to deal with the toughest things than actually things just returning to the way they were. So it's going to be an interesting time, but when we get through this, we'll have a lot that we've learned and we'll be stronger. I hope you've enjoyed this video. It's been a pleasure to do, and if you've got any further questions or queries or just want to get in touch, you can contact me via LinkedIn or through my practice website www.babr.co.uk. Take care. Bye.